Thank you for inviting me back to my favorite state. You're saying, all right, if Michigan's your favorite state, why do you live in Florida? I think Jerry Seinfeld summed it up. He said, it's not that old people want to move to Florida, it's the law. But I'm delighted to be here. I had a wonderful dinner last night with Jack and Lois, Larry, Deborah, and felt like I was really getting into the spirit and developing a deeper understanding of what MTA is all about. And I commend all of you for the wonderful work you're doing, because the level at which you are doing it is where our problems have to be solved as a country. So I'm honored and pleased to be here with you. A wise friend of mine who does a lot of public speaking, he said, Mort, always remember, if you can't say it in 30 minutes, go home and write a book. Well, your program people in their wisdom told me I had to fill the better part of an hour this morning. And when they told me that, I immediately thought of the little girl in the 3rd grade who wrote an essay on Socrates, and it was very short and to the point. She said, Socrates was a wise man who lived a long time ago. He made a long speech. His friends poisoned him. So I may not speak a full hour this morning. The lady who cuts my hair down in Florida has the answer to all the world's problems. Just ask her. And I've been going to her for over 10 years. And so one year for Christmas, I got her a sign that I had appropriately mounted in a frame. It's a quote by George Burns. It says, too bad the only people who have all the answers to the world's problems are either driving cabs or cutting hair. I gave that to her, and she proudly displays it on at her place of work. How many of you have been watching the debates? No? You know, as I watch these people scrambling to take on the toughest job in the world, I think back to what Barbara Bush said when her husband was seeking a second term, and she was being interviewed on the Today Show, and you know, she had a quick wit and a very dry sense of humor. And I don't remember who the host was. It might have been Bryant Gumbel. I don't remember who was hosting the Today Show at that time, but whoever it was said, Mrs. Bush, what do you think about your husband seeking a second term as president? And she said, you know, it's always been my opinion that anyone who would seek to be president of the United States is clearly not mentally competent to hold the job. These are tough times we live in. Any position of leadership today is demanding. And government positions such as you hold are especially demanding. With budgets being reduced, revenue streams being limited, and people still demanding more and more from those who serve them. It was Christmas 2009, and my wife and I had gone to spend the holidays with her youngest son, Randy, his wife Jamie, and their 3 children, our grandchildren. We'd been there a couple of days when Renee's cell phone rang, and it was her other son, Jeff, who lives in Indianapolis. And he said, Mom, I've got bad news. Carolyn, that's his wife, has just been diagnosed with an aggressive and very, very difficult form of leukemia. She was 36. He insisted, and she insisted, that we continue our Christmas plans with his brother and his family. And we did, but immediately after Christmas, we headed for Indianapolis, where Carolyn was put in the hospital, started a very tough regimen of chemotherapy. We tried to be of as much help to Jeff and our 5-year-old grandson as we possibly could be. We'd been there 2 days when Renee's phone rang again, and it was her son in Florida, in Vero Beach. Mom, I know what you're dealing with up there, and I don't know how to break this to you gently, but Zach has just been diagnosed with a malignant brain tumor. Zach is was our 15-year-old grandson at that time. We were in shock. We were stunned. We were in disbelief. How could cancer have struck our daughter-in-law and our teenage grandson within a 2-week period? How could we face it? How could we deal with it? Suddenly, we wanted to roll back the calendar. Back before that first phone call, back before that second phone call, we wanted life to be the way it had been. You ever get that feeling? You look at the world around you and you look at the changes, not all of them good, some of them good, and you say, if we could just go back before 2008 when the housing bubble burst, before the financial crisis, before the loss of all those jobs, if we could just roll back the clock, maybe roll it all the way back to the 1950s when it felt like life was at least stable and there was a middle class that seemed to be thriving in this country and the American dream was very much alive and well, if we could just go back. But you and I know there's no going back. Any more than Renee and I could reverse the calendar and go back to the time before our loved ones had been struck by cancer. Transition is not new. I can imagine that Adam, as he's walking out of the garden, turns to Eve and said, "I believe we are in transition." And it's been that way ever since. It's not all bad. Much of it is good. We were in the car with my son, Al, the other day, and we decided to go to a restaurant and have dinner out, and Renee says, "Gee, I wish I had brought my phone book. I could make a call and make a reservation." And my son looked at her with mild contempt, and he said, "Renee, you've got the entire worldwide internet in your telephone." But for those of us who grew up with black and white TVs and vinyl records, you know what a record is? Kind of hard to make the adjustment. I like the new technologies. I love the new technologies. I have a DVD of a program that has been seen on several television stations, including here in Detroit, documenting the bucket list trip that I made. I'm not going to get into that this morning, but any of you who want to attend my breakout session this afternoon, we're going to talk about flying my airplane solo and camping for 30 days, 7,400 miles to celebrate my 74th birthday. It was the ultimate bucket list trip. And because of the new technology, I was able to take a handheld, high-definition Sony camera, just about that big, and document the entire trip. And when I got back, I used the same equipment that the studios in Hollywood used for Spider-Man 2, an iMac. And I sat down in my little home studio and I downloaded my video and I wrote a script and I edited it, I put it together, I produced it in its final form, and it went on television. One person. 15, 20 years ago, it would have taken at least 20 people to do what I was able to do because of the new technology. Now, we have a home edition of that video. We're going to have an autograph signing, a book signing for any of you who might be interested in some of my books immediately following this speech, and it will be on the table, and we're going to show part of it at the breakout section. So some of the things are good, but you know, our memories, we have a way of sort of forgetting the bad and remembering the good from the so-called good old days. My mother, bless her, remembered me as the perfect child. My baby sister had a somewhat different recollection of how I had made her life pretty miserable at times. I grew up in the Cold War. We worry about terrorism. Any of you old enough to remember when the teachers made you get under the desk to simulate what you would do in case of a nuclear attack? I never quite understood how a wooden school desk was going to protect you from an atom bomb, but that was part of the ritual that we went through back in the day when we knew that within 30 minutes a Russian-launched missile attack could incinerate our country, could destroy our major cities, and could end life and civilization as we have known it. We lived with those fears. As bad as things are today on the international front with our concerns about Iran getting a nuclear bomb, our concerns about North Korea, our concerns about the turmoil in the Middle East and about terrorism, I don't think any of us go to bed at night wondering if we'll wake up the next morning or if our civilization will be destroyed. So in many ways, the good old days weren't that good. In 1963, I was working for ABC in New York. There were no African Americans in our newsroom, no African Americans covering the White House. Now one is living there. There were no women in our newsroom except for a couple of secretaries. Now we have a woman anchoring the ABC Evening News, and you find women and African Americans in positions, journalism, throughout all of the channels, all of the cables, and all of the local stations. I think one of the lines I heard that best summarizes the advancements that have been made in gender equality, you may have to think about this one for just a moment, but today, a flight attendant can get a pilot pregnant. You didn't have to think too long about that one. There is no future in the past. What about the American dream? A friend of mine was in my home the other day. I maintain a small office in my home, and I have a picture gallery. Rini calls it my Love Me room. And it has pictures of famous people that I've interviewed and some that I've worked with. And this friend of mine was looking at all these pictures of Colin Powell and Ted Koppel and George Bush and a lot of different people on the wall, Ronald Reagan, also some Democrats. And this friend said, "Krim, you got a great future behind you." And I thought about that line, and I thought, is that sometimes how we feel about America? We've got a great future behind us. Well, admittedly, the gulf today between the rich and poor is of concern. 30 years ago, the average top CEO in any of our corporations, the average, would earn about 28 times what the average worker took home. Today, it is 158 times and rising. I think one of the greatest issues that we have to confront today, and this is not any attempt to create a class war. If you haven't noticed, we're kind of in a class war. We're kind of in a war between the haves who seem to be having more all the time and the have-nots who seem to be slipping more and more from the middle class into the ranks of poverty. And that is not a political statement, it is an actual observation as a journalist of what's going on in our society. Now, jobs may seem to be the biggest problem we have, and existentially at the moment, I would agree. Finding jobs is the biggest problem we have. But the unemployment situation in our country is really a symptom of some other problems that have gone unattended for at least the last 2 decades and probably longer, and one of them, and a crucial one, is education. For too long, we have looked at education as primarily a social issue, and you know what happens to social issues when budgets get tight. When budgets get slashed, social issues are usually the first ones to go. Education is so much more than a social issue in our country. It is the key to our economic success and our economic future. And we haven't treated it that way. There was a book that came out shortly after the war between the states. It was entitled A True, Honest, Fair, Impartial, Unbiased Account of the Civil War, as seen from the Southern point of view.